Good afternoon. I'm Brian Hosmer, Department Head, and on behalf of the Oklahoma State University Department of History and the Edmund Lowe Library, it's my pleasure to host a series of events featuring History Department scholars with books that appeared this past year. We come to you from the library's wonderful Angie DeBow room, which is a most appropriate venue for historians who are interested in public and community engagement. In a moment, I want to introduce tonight's featured speaker, but first let me say a few words about this series. We have essentially three goals for Why It Matters. The first is to celebrate the accomplishments of our colleagues. As many of you may know, books represent the gold standard for scholarly achievement for historians. We write books, we read books, we're interested in books. It is unusual, perhaps unprecedented, for Oklahoma State University History Department to have 5 colleagues with books appearing in the same year, but that's the case this year. It's a remarkable achievement, and we really want to celebrate that. So goal number 1 is to celebrate our colleagues. A second goal is really to ask why history matters to historians. So we're really interested in probing the ideas that our historians bring to us and the books that they've written, and to figure out what is it that drove those ideas. Where's the passion? Why does history matter to historians? And a third goal speaks to why it matters and why history matters for all of us generally. History provides context and perspective. It helps us make sense of the world around us. And so each of these books that we've celebrated over the course of the year in one way and many ways speaks not only to a particular moment in time, but to larger questions that resonate through the centuries and to today. Our series began in November with Dr. Holly Caribou, who talked to us about border policing and border enforcement. Then in December, Dr. Laura Arata shared a fascinating story of race and gender and violence and memory in a Montana community. In February, we picked up the story with Dr. Justin Prince, who talked to us about American artillery during the First World War. And just last month, we had a fascinating conversation about motivational ideology in the 20th century American workplace with Dr. David Gray. So each of these pieces, right, each of these books speaks to why history matters to all of us more generally. Tonight's our last in the series, last of 5. But I want to assure you that we're not going anywhere. Thanks to the healthy response and our wonderful scholars, we're already scheming for season 2 and thinking through different kinds of possibilities. You can expect to see different formats perhaps and different ways of engaging scholarship, but why it matters will still be their focal point. We're still going to talk about why history matters to us, to broader culture, and how it affects our lives. So why it matters, so keep an eye open for us on Facebook, and maybe send us a message or 2 via social media and tell us what you might want to hear. So before we move in, let me thank a few people. These kinds of events don't happen out of nowhere. They're complicated, they require a lot of work. And so first I want to express my deep appreciation for Dr. Sarah Griswold, Assistant Professor of History in our department, who has devoted considerable time and effort, and in fact diverted her public or used her public programming experiences that she developed in other places to really conceptualize and organize this whole series. So we're grateful to her for doing that. Katana Davis is our social media intern, and she's really worked hard to upgrade and bolster our social media presence, and so we're super grateful for that. We're grateful as well to our Oklahoma State Library's production team. There's all kinds of stuff happening that you can't see behind the camera here, and what makes it so special is that you can't see it and you can't notice it. 90% of things that happen in public programming are out of view, and so we really appreciate that. We're thankful to Oklahoma State University's College of Arts and Sciences and the Foundation. And in fact, I want to direct your attention to the Give Orange campaign, which is a way, if you're so inclined, to direct some fiscal support, financial support to history. So take a look at Give Orange, Oklahoma State University's Foundation's program for giving. So with that, let me move and talk a little bit about tonight's speaker and move to an introduction and to the main event. Richard J. Boles is assistant professor of history in our department. He received his PhD from the George Washington University and graduated summa cum laude from Boston College with a BA in history. Dr. Boles specializes in early American and United States history, particularly African American and Native American history from the colonial era to the middle of the 19th century. He teaches a wide range of courses for us. He's particularly interested in American religious history. He's interested in race relations in Northern Protestant churches from 1730s to the 1850s, and in addition to a number of scholarly productions, his first book, Dividing the Faith, The Rise of Segregated Churches in the Early American North, published by New York University Press, examines the transition from racially diverse churches to separate American Indian and African American congregations by the early 19th century in the Mid-Atlantic and in New England. Dr. Boles' research has been supported by a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grant, an Albert J. Beveridge grant, Gilder Lehrman Research Fellowship, an American Congregational Association Boston Athenaeum Fellowship, a Massachusetts Historical Society Fellowship, as well as grants from the College of Arts and Sciences. So with that, welcome and congratulations on this great book.
Thank you so much.
So what I want to do is get started the way we kind of have on all of these occasions, and that is tell me a little bit about how you became interested in this topic. What drew you to studying American religious history during the colonial and early republic period, but also particularly with this interest in race right across multiple frames? What drove you? What interested you in this topic?
Yeah, I've always loved history and always learned about history, especially with my mom. But my passion particularly for this topic, race and religion, came from my favorite undergraduate teacher at Boston College, Cynthia Lynn Lyerly, who had great courses on early America and religion and race and gender. And that is probably where the origin really started. The questions for this book came from working as a National Park Ranger at the Boston African American National Historic Site. And that site ends or includes the 1806 African Meeting House, which is the first African American church in Boston and the oldest African American religious building still in existence in the country. And I knew African Americans or enslaved Africans had been brought to Boston as early as 1638, but I hadn't learned much, I hadn't heard much about that period of 1630s up until the separate black church in 1806. And I was curious and wanted to learn more about the religious beliefs and religious practices of African Americans in Massachusetts and across the North. And it grew to cover most of the North, and also learned that I really can't talk about race in America without also talking about indigenous people. And
Indeed.
So that expanded it as well.
That's a wonderful trajectory, right? I mean, I love hearing we all both do as professors, how your professor made an impact on you, but also just your direct experience sort of in living history and in parks sort of really clued you in. That's a great combination of things. So in important ways, this book is about recovering a forgotten past, right? There's some way that really operates around that, or maybe forgotten pasts in the plural. There's more than one trajectory here. What's the conventional story that we first? And I'm also interested, maybe in that context, why you began your book with Phyllis Wheatley. And it seems to me that those two questions, for me anyway, came together.
Yeah, so people have been writing about the history of the North, maybe particularly the history of New England's religion, since the 17th century. Puritans were writing about themselves and their parents and their grandparents. So we've been writing about the history of religion in New England in the colonial era, almost since the beginning of colonization. But up until the 1960s and 1970s, that story was overwhelmingly a story about white leaders and white ministers, and about theology or institutions. And then in the turn, the 60s and 70s, started focusing more on the experience of people in the pews, the experiences of women, the experience of Native Americans in New England. And so in some ways, I'm building on that scholarly trajectory since the mid to late 20th century. And Phyllis Wheatley fits in with that. In some ways, she's the most famous African-American
Indeed.
Christian of the colonial era. There's been lots of books published about her. She was the most famous Black Christian of her own time period as well, in Boston especially. So she's gotten a lot of attention. We've known about her, but she in some ways has seemed like a exception or a marginalized story.
I see.
And in fact, her life was exceptional. Right? She's an enslaved woman, stolen from Africa when she's 7 or 6 years old. Her experience of enslavement is unique. She's educated. She learns how to read Latin. She gets her poetry published in newspapers and in book form in London, England. So all that makes her exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
But her church affiliation, I found, was not exceptional. It was quite ordinary. And so we've got this mix of a sort of a famous individual that we know about and we think of as being exceptional, and she was. But in that particular part of being a church member, she was quite ordinary in that most New England congregational churches included Black congregants, not ones that went to publish poetry like Phyllis Wheatley, but ones that engaged with baptism, worship, communion, membership in a predominantly white religious space.
So thinking about her and what's written and what's not really offers kind of an insight into where this book goes, right? Here's the part we know, but then there's all this other stuff. There's all this other context. That's wonderful. So I want to remind everybody that we are watching Why It Matters, Talks on the American Past with Dr. Richard Boles, and invite you to enter some questions into the Facebook chat if you're so inclined, and they'll make their way to this tablet next to me, and then we'll proceed there. So let's move on here, and I am interested in sort of walking through some of what you're discussing here. So the book really begins in the 1730s and 40s. You dip back to some earlier times, but that's really where things go. So if you can, describe that world and describe how persons of different statuses interacted in these religious settings. Why did Indians join white churches? What could enslaved Blacks find in those same churches?
Yeah. One of my friends and colleagues described 18th century Boston with the term unfreedom. Unfreedom is the norm. Most people don't have freedom. Native Americans are more free than African Americans, but many Native Americans are also enslaved or in bondage of indentured servitude, or their land's been stolen, so they're in poverty. African Americans are overwhelmingly enslaved, so the vast majority doesn't have the right to their person, does not have protection for their children or their spouses. So there's a lot of unfreedom there. Women are subject to men, either fathers or husbands. So the normal condition of this hierarchical, monarchical society, right? Everyone's subject to the king, is sort of unfreedom in general. So everybody, ideally, in these churches, these churches encompass everybody in the society. Now that's the ideal. It's not always in practice. But that inclusion is not on terms of equality, because the society is not organized on terms of equality. So the churches reflect and reinforce the social hierarchy that includes a hierarchy of gender and race and class and education, and et cetera. So in some ways, we have a hard time understanding why an enslaved African American or a Native American would be joining an institution that is a part of that impression. But I think if we look at the whole picture, we understand, right, that everything is a part of a hierarchical society at this moment in time. There are moments and ways, though, that this institution, the church, the social institution, which supports slavery, supports in many cases dispossessing Indians, there's moments there of where a person can find a particular benefit. So for enslaved African Americans and Native Americans, churches are offering education, learning how to read. And that's clearly an important draw for many African Americans and Native Americans who are participating in northern churches. A lot of these churches are offering classes for reading and writing, and for these groups of people, that's a powerful motivation to go to the church. They are offering sacraments religious sacraments that people are pursuing after. There's a case of John Bingus, who seems to have been a Roman Catholic in either Spanish or Portuguese empires or in Africa. And this person clearly wanted baptism for his daughter. And so he affiliated with a predominantly white church to have his daughter baptized. He valued baptism for his daughter. He sought out her. He was free and sought after it. So there's religious motivations, there's sort of learning, there's education, there's the status of being a church member, which is a powerful status in colonial society. And so there's a range of reasons why these people might have joined or did join churches.
I think that's really useful and important to keep in mind. And I particularly like the way you frame that as a place, this is a society defined by the absence of freedom, right, or the absence of liberty, and also by status and hierarchy and ranking. And so this helps us understand a little bit why Native people may have chosen to, and African Americans chosen this church. So let me ask you the other side of this. So do these tensions, right? So this church membership is happening in a certain context, and it's happening in the context of dispossession of Native people, and also, as you say, enslavement, right? Mm-hmm. So do those tensions ever manifest? Do they ever make their way into, into the sort of general conversation that you read, or they put it maybe another way, does it ever make its way into the sources that you see?
Yeah, clearly we see some conflict between people who are holding others as slaves and the Christianity, or what they think Christianity means, and the experience of churches and Christianity for enslaved people. I can think of an Anglican minister in Rhode Island who thought that a couple of his slaves were stealing food. And the minister wrote out this prayer, basically asking God to help his enslaved people obey him better.
Interesting.
We can imagine that the enslaved people's prayers were very different.
One would think. But then again, right, hard to know. Yeah, in this status, in this world that you're describing, but certainly.
Yeah, and we have some examples where enslaved people join a church that is not the church where their master goes.
Interesting.
So one enslaved person owned by a congregational minister went to the neighboring town to participate in the church. And we don't know much about it. We don't have his voice, but what has been passed down is that he went to this other church because of a theological dispute. And so there are enough examples of agency within the confines of slavery. Options are limited, but still enslaved people pushing for recognition, autonomy, choice, making decisions, negotiating within the confines of slavery.
These are the kinds of bits and pieces that are really important to historians of colonial America and early national America, right? Is that you're not likely to see somebody with a full frontal attack on systems of inequality. It will manifest itself in these other ways. So that's where the careful reading and the real history work takes place. So you just mentioned this question of denomination. So you brought up the Congregationalists and talked about the possibility that enslaved people would join a church other than the one that their master joined. So tell us a little bit about the denominations, right? So who's involved here, and are there denominational differences between denominational differences in the way that churches receive and attract people of color?
Yeah, absolutely. The denominations really matter. And there are rules about how to become a member. There are rules about who can be baptized and when, meaning that some churches were much more accessible and we might say open to receiving indigenous people and black people, and other churches were more resistant to it. So throughout most of the 18th century, Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed churches were the least open, least accessible. they had a particularly high bar for baptism. You had to, at the time you wanted to be baptized as an adult convert, you also had to become a full church member and a communicant. And that was a higher, more difficult thing to do. You had to convince the minister and the members that you were worthy to be a communicant.
I see.
Whereas the Anglicans and the Lutherans and the Congregationalists provided access to baptism in a much easier way. With Congregationalists, it was the halfway covenant, which made it sort of a simple profession of faith for an adult to be baptized. And it sort of separated baptism from being a full member and communicant. And Anglicans with their idea of a parish, where we sort of welcome, and Lutherans welcome everybody in the community, and everyone has a right to access of baptism.
I see.
Meant that those churches, it was relatively easier for an adult enslaved person or an adult Native American to seek out and receive baptism there, or to receive baptism for their children in those places. And I think the rules, and also to the extent to which the different denominations are funding missionaries to directly reach out to these groups of people.
Right.
The Anglicans spend a lot of money, put a lot of resources into missionaries specifically to teach African Americans literacy and about Christianity. Congregationalists spend a lot of money on missionaries to New England's indigenous people, New York's indigenous people, and that has an effect as well.
So I think it's really right, an important part of this, and that when we're talking about the churches, we're speaking about places that are structurally different and in some ways have different institutional cultures at work here, right? And then so this translates into different kinds of congregations with regard to race. So we have a couple of questions coming in on the through the chat, so I'm going to make our way through a few of them. One is a source issue, and it asks, can you discuss the types of sources and methodology you use to be able to access indigenous and enslaved people's voices and perspectives? So this is a nice follow-up to where we're going right now.
That's a great question. The thousands of African Americans who are sort of behind this book, the thousands of African Americans who participate in a Northern church. I have the words from very, very few of them. I have letters and poetry from Phyllis Wheatley, or I have letters and sermons and hymns from Sansom Okum. I have an anti-slavery sermon from one enslaved person in Connecticut, but they're words in their own hand, or words even as recorded by a white person, are far and few between. So in that, I sort of have to rely more on reading against the grain in white authored sources, but I'm also reading the actions. And I would say that the actions of enslaved African Americans, the actions of indigenous people, when sort of taken in aggregate, speak pretty loudly about their religious activities, their religious preferences.
Indeed.
So I looked at about 450 churches, and I looked at their baptismal lists, their membership lists, who's taking communion, who's being disciplined, who's getting married.
Wow.
And again, sort of this, like, back to it's a unfree society. Everybody in these old church records is referenced in relationship to a white male head of household. So a widow of, wife of, daughter of, son of, servant of, enslaved servant of, and there's racial notations throughout the record. So I'm looking at hundreds of churches and counting and keeping track of the hundreds of Native Americans and the thousands of African Americans who are participating in the churches in different ways. Putting that all together, then I can get a pretty clear picture of their actions. Where are they showing up? What are they doing? And I think in that way, their actions speak to us, even if I don't have their words.
So it's really painstaking work, and you're piecing together a lot of indirect evidence and learning how to use these sources when the direct quotes from people of color, things in their hand, are exceedingly rare. But the nice thing about that, right, is that doesn't mean stories are lost.
Mm-hmm.
It just simply means that historians learn how to investigate and tell the stories. And that's the real craft, right? That's the art as well as the science, it seems to me, of doing this kind of history. So I want to remind you that you're watching Why It Matters, Talks on the American Past. Dr. Richard Boles is here with us, and we're discussing Dividing the Faith, the Rise of Segregated Churches in the Early American North. Fantastic book, really rich, deeply researched. So let me move through some more questions here. I have a few more, and the questions are coming in through the chat, and I'll try to weave them together as best we can, and at least in a coherent fashion. So I'm interested now, we can dig down even a little bit farther. So let's kind of go down this rabbit hole a little bit. And now that we've established that we have people of color in these churches, and that we can kind of ferret out a little bit of what these congregations look like, and also the distinctions between the denominations. So we're learning about this. Are we able to develop a sense of how people of color interacted with one another, specifically indigenous people and African Americans? And we ask this in some ways for obvious reasons from the perspective of the 20th century, where we use terms like people of color. And we look at use terms like marginalized people, and then that which communicates that there's some sort of shared, right, experience. Mm-hmm. And so let's dip back to the 18th century, and that's sort of what drives this question: is do we know anything about that, about those interactions?
Yeah, and there's moments where the experience of Black people and the experience of Pequot, Mohican, Narragansett, Wampanoag converge and are similar in this story, and there are other moments where they really diverge and have on sort of separate paths. So without a doubt, some Mohican, Narragansett, Wampanoag, Shinnecock interact with African Americans in predominantly white churches. They're going to be segregated in the same area of some of these churches and meeting houses. One of the appeals of some of these churches might be that the servants, the enslaved people from across town, get to reconnect and connect with each other Sunday at the church, whereas they're sort of scattered over a series of farms. Mm-hmm. We see more intense interaction develop in the late 18th century on the Native American land reserves. So the Pequot reserves in Connecticut, Mohican, Narragansetts have a fairly large piece of land in Rhode Island, Mashpee on Cape Cod. In these places where Native Americans often have founded their own churches and have land under cultivation, as African Americans are gaining freedom, some African Americans are moving to those indigenous communities.
I see.
And there's a gender imbalance in New England in particular. There are more African American men than women. And because of the high death rates in the military and in seafaring, there tend to be more Native American women than men. And so Black men and indigenous women are intermarrying fairly frequently at the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. So many of the Indian churches, the church the Narragansett's church, the Wampanoag church on Martha's Vineyard or at Mashpee, those churches become interracial because they become Afro-Indian or part Black and part indigenous churches. And that also happens in the cities, where some of the Native Americans who are going to the cities for work end up living in the quote unquote Black community or Black neighborhood and joining or participating in these African American churches. And white New Englanders convinced themselves that Native Americans are disappearing, which
Indeed.
They didn't, but
Right.
White Americans convinced themselves were. And part of how they convinced themselves that that was happening was that white people started classifying Black people and Native Americans as both colored. And that's the term that they were using to describe both groups, and in that way sort of imagining that Indians are gone.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. We're going to come back to that
Okay.
story in a little bit. I find that this whole notion of erasure and forgetting and it's really a fundamental part of what develops into the kind of New England New Englanders' view of their past, right?
Yeah.
And that there's a time before, and then there's a time now, right? And
Mhm.
and the people of color disappear. Other things disappear too. Institutions disappear.
Yeah,
Of,
that's right.
of one sort or another. So there's a fascinating question that's come in from the chat that takes us a little bit of a different direction, but I really like this. And so the question is this: how does the physical design and architecture of early New England church buildings reinforce or contrast with your argument? For instance, are whites, blacks, and Native Americans baptized in the same baptismal spaces? Are New England churches segregated in their original design, or do racial groups sit and mingle together? How or does this change over time, especially in the context of the Great Awakening? So we're going to probably move and talk a little bit about the Great Awakening anyway.
Yeah, the physical spaces of the meeting houses or churches themselves typically reflected the social hierarchy as it's envisioned in the 18th century or the 19th century. In the 18th century, people are usually assigned where they're allowed to sit. So, for example, the Old South Church in Boston, where Phyllis Wheatley ended up joining, they spent extra money to add extra decoration for the pew where the governor sat. But children sat in a portion of the gallery. Servants, including slaves, sat in a different portion of the gallery. They hired somebody to oversee the children and servants in the gallery. So there's a sense where in the 18th century, people are assigned where they sit, and the seating in the whole reflects the social hierarchy. So I call these churches interracial but not integrated.
Yeah, okay.
And so the churches these Christians are envisioning a sense of them all being Christian together. They're envisioning that Black and Indian people will be in heaven with them too one day. And certainly in the rituals of baptism, communion, everyone who's a member participates. But there's always lines drawn. And so in a lot of churches, when there's communion, they will have Black or Indian people take it later, after all the white people have taken communion.
So the physical structure, right? The place reinforces, replicates, structures these kinds of statuses.
Yeah.
At least informally, if not really quite directly informally.
There are a few exceptions here and
course.
there. And what's interesting is the church at Mashpee, the Wampanoag Church, they require white people to sit in the back.
That's
so
fascinating.
It's sort of a reversal of what was the normal
That's
experience.
great, right? That's fascinating. Right there it is. It's both a demonstration of agency and then also sort of strangely, right, an adoption of the very principles that had marginalized them, right? So that's a fascinating aspect of human behavior. So let's talk a little bit about the 1760s, and this builds on one part of this question, and we see kind of an increase in interracial, and I appreciate you made the distinction between interracial and integrated, right? Worship in the 1760s. So kind of describe how and why that happened. What are the forces at work that lead to an increase in this phenomenon? Yeah.
The 1760s and 1770s is an incredibly important moment in this narrative, and there's a lot going on. And one of the big reasons why the number of interracial churches grows is because of the arrival of Methodists.
I see.
The Methodism is a reform movement that starts in England to reform the Church of England. It starts arriving very slowly in the northern colonies, New York, in the 1760s. And then, in 100 years, it becomes the largest Protestant denomination in the country. So, but it's this really slow start. And so the arrival of the Methodists, their dramatic growth in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. And Methodists were interracial from the beginning. They were quite deliberate in reaching out to, preaching to, inviting to join to African Americans, in some places Native Americans. And so the arrival of the Methodists is one reason why there's sort of an expansion of interracial worship. Baptist churches go through an expansion as well and shift into sort of a more revivalistic focus. And they did not tend to include very many African Americans before the 1760s, but as they're going through a pretty rapid expansion, they are also growing in part by reaching out to to African Americans. The first Baptist Church of Providence, Rhode Island, is very old. It goes back to Roger Williams, but there's a big jump in African American membership in the 1770s and 1780s, in part because the minister seems to have really actively sought out that community to preach to them, to invite them.
The role of a particular preacher,
Yeah.
right, in trying to grow things. So when we think about this period of time and we're moving into to the revolutionary period, it seems to me that there's kind of an interesting, at least potentially, set of conversations that are taking place here. So you have in many denominations, certainly not all, an increase in interracial worship within the structures that you've described. At the same time, you have, right, the continuation of these statuses and hierarchies, particularly in the revolutionary period, that began to push back against notions of ascribed status
Mm-hmm.
and a hierarchy. One aspect, as we know, of the revolutionary period is not simply just liberty from Britain. It's about this whole idea of hierarchy, this whole notion of inherited status. So do we see any kind of tensions working out there as this new Enlightenment revolutionary ideology kind of dovetails a little bit with, a Great Awakening, and yet you still have these congregations that are built around status?
Yeah, there's some real tension there. And I think, to be clear, African Americans are the ones that first made the case that Christianity means freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So as early as early colonial period, African Americans are making that claim. But in New England, we see an enslaved man making an anti-slavery sermon in 1754. African Americans petitioning for freedom in Connecticut and Massachusetts and in Philadelphia, and their anti-slavery, their calls to end slavery are based on Christian ideas, Christian principles. They're interpreting scripture in an anti-slavery way, and also usually adopting the language of the revolution: liberty, freedom, all men born equal. We have a right to freedom, and they're trying to make this claim for ending slavery with both sort of democratic Republican ideals, revolutionary ideals, and Christian ideals. And so it's African Americans pushing white churches to start moving towards an anti-slavery position. And so there's some tension there, right? Not all these churches want to be going in an anti-slavery position, but certainly when white ministers like Samuel Hopkins and others adopt anti-slavery principle, that helps bring about the very gradual, slow end of legal slavery across New England, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. But white Christians eventually are comfortable with ending slavery. They don't become comfortable with equality.
Indeed.
And so that's where the tension continues.
Right.
So as slavery ends, and many white Christians help that happen, there's still the problem of inequality. And now that you're a democratic republic, that you're claiming all men are born free and equal, African Americans are saying, yes, we are. And the churches are not willing to integrate really the pews and to treat them as equal. And they might ordain a black preacher, but not allow that black preacher to preach to white people, or might sort of limit or circumvent in other ways the rights, the voting rights, the church voting rights of African American church members.
So the churches are becoming wise. They're becoming aware of the implications of this whole process, the revolutionary ideology, and even before that, kind of democratization of religion in some fashion, right? Mm-hmm. They're becoming aware that, wait a minute, this is, there's a trajectory, right? There's a place that this goes that we're not super comfortable with.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. We've mentioned a number of, you've talked about preachers and you've mentioned people. And so, and as a kind of general category, one of the things I really like about this book, among many things, are these short vignettes, the kind of little biographical sketches. So maybe you can talk about some of the people in this book that you think are interesting, but also perhaps emblematic of the story that you want to tell?
Hmm.
Samson Occom.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
first thing that came to mind.
Yeah.
Is Samson Occom, right? Samson Occom is Mohican. He's born in Connecticut in the 1720s. Starts engaging with Christianity in the 1730s and 40s. Goes to Wheelock School, right? Gets trained in theology by Connecticut Congregational ministers, and eventually becomes the first Native American Presbyterian minister. He's ordained. But even before that point, he becomes a school teacher at Montauk, at the very easternmost point of Long Island. And so the Montaukets invite him to come and teach them at their school. But he becomes more than a teacher, he becomes really a minister. He's preaching sermons there, and he can speak indigenous languages but English. And there's a white missionary, an English missionary in the area, but he's sort of spread out with lots of different locations that he visits, and he can only preach in English. So Samson Occom ends up helping create separate churches among the Montaukets, and preaches to separate churches among the Mohicans, Pequots, Shinnecocks, and others, and becomes a really influential leader in Native American-run churches, but is still engaged with sort of some of the white denominations, helping fundraise, goes to England to help fundraise for, he believes, to help fund education for Native American people. And so he's really a fascinating case, and we have so much of his writing that's really rich. He talks really highly about a lot of white ministers that he interacts with, but he also notes that these white missionaries will spend lavish amounts of money on a white missionary, but they don't pay me anything. And he notes it's because I'm Indian, is what he says, and he recognizes the racism that he experiences. Another person that comes to mind is Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes was
there's a great engraving of him.
Lemuel Haynes was indentured as a child, as a baby. He's raised by a white family, and throughout his childhood, he owes them labor. Right, he's a farm laborer. He's an indentured servant. He gets his freedom right as the Revolution's starting, and he goes to Boston area, and he's there during the siege of Boston, and he's fights in the Revolutionary War. He writes a poem, sermon sort of thing against slavery, right, connecting again that Christianity and revolutionary ideals as being against slavery. And he gets trained and ordained, and he's a African-American minister of a predominantly white Connecticut church for a couple of years before he goes up to Vermont and leads the West Rutland Congregational Church for about 30 years, an African-American minister of a predominantly white church. And that happens occasionally, mostly in areas like northern New England where there's a shortage of ministers.
Yeah. These are fascinating characters.
Yeah.
And they really they do a beautiful job, or you do a beautiful job with them, to illustrate some of these points that you want to make. And so you move down, here's the experience of this particular person. There's several of them. I really love that aspect of the book. So you're watching Why It Matters, Talks on the American Past. We're here with Dr. Richard Boles, and we're talking about Dividing the Faith, his wonderful book that's just out in the past year, The Rise of Segregated Worship in New England or in the early American North. I got a disciplinary question that's come through, a research question that's come through, and then I want to come back to a couple things, and we'll really sort of hit the clincher here, right, where the story really turns in a lot of ways. So a question comes in. Church disciplinary records are fascinating. Do you notice any racial or gender discrepancies in the types and number of disciplinary actions? So maybe you can tell us what the disciplinary records are, and also why they're important.
Yeah. So the point of church discipline was always to keep the church membership, pure from blatant sin, what they defined as sinful practices. So they are going to call church members, halfway members or full members, in to meet with the church, and they will, if there's been an allegation of misconduct. And so the person could be admonished, warned, you need to do better, or they could eventually be, excommunicated and kicked out of the church. So you can't have communion anymore. They usually sought repentance. They wanted people to ask for forgiveness and then be restored. That was what the purpose was supposed to be. Historians have argued that there wasn't evidence for Black or Indigenous people being subject to church discipline more frequently than white members. And white church members are disciplined for all sorts of things, often for excessive drinking, often for a child being born too soon after a marriage, things like that. I did find, though, in Deerfield, Massachusetts, in the mid-18th century, there were a lot of discipline cases for enslaved African Americans in that town. And the number of African Americans facing discipline was far higher proportionately to the number engaged in the church than of the white. And that minister in particular gave a sermon titled, basically a sermon to slaves, telling them how important obedience was. And one of those slaves faced church discipline for disobedience to master, a charge that a white church member could have never faced. Moreover, servants and slaves, whether they're Native American or African American, in a white household are going to be subject to more surveillance, right? The person that has bonded or enslaved labor in their household is watching that person much more than they watch their neighbor church member. So
we have a surveillance society.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about that now,
yeah.
right? Surveillance society in the 18th century.
Yeah, especially people in their own household.
Yeah, how interesting. Those disciplinary records are really fascinating, right? They do give you an insight on something of the sort of tenor and the culture of the church.
Yeah,
right?
sort of like court records too, right?
Yeah.
You see the conflicts, you see the disagreements. Sometimes people show up only in
those places
when they're in trouble.
Right, exactly, which is kind of an interesting historical and historian's question as well, sort of what you do with that. So what I want to do is move to kind of a clincher here, and there are a couple of other questions that are coming in, and so we'll see if we can get to them. I'll do my best. So you alluded to this a little while ago, and so the big turn in this book moves from a period of time, lengthy, where we have interracial worship, again, within the constraints that you've described. So we understand that this is interracial worship, it's not integrated worship, and those are critically different, to a point where it ends. It ends, right? And so we move from interracial churches to segregated churches. And you track this fairly precisely, and it's a real profound thing to read, right? And all of a sudden, this religious landscape is different. So maybe you alluded to it a minute ago. We can talk a little bit more about it, and then I want to get to some of the reaction to it.
Yeah, so there's the Native Americans in southern New England found churches in the 1750s and leave, for the most part. African Americans start forming separate churches in the 1790s, 1800, 1810. But for a while, African American separate churches and interracial churches are growing together. So there's a moment of contingency. Are interracial churches going to keep going alongside separate Black churches? Or are they going to be replaced? And the answer comes really in the 1820s and 1830s, when the numbers of Black and the few indigenous people still participating in white churches plummets. Mm-hmm. And in the 1830s, really we find very, very few comparatively cases of African Americans or Native Americans participating in predominantly white churches. And that has a lot to do with what else is going on in the 1820s and 30s, the moment of creating universal white male suffrage, the democratic revolution of expanding equality for white men is also a moment of pushing for colonization and expulsion and separation for Native Americans and African Americans, Indian removal in the North and the Midwest and the South, Indian removals, plural, colonization society, race riots against Northern African Americans, right? So there's this context of the antebellum period where any social interaction, any religious interaction, meets a lot of hostility by a lot in the dominant society.
How do we explain that?
In some ways, it goes back to that comment earlier that I made where white people were convinced in the North that slavery is bad, but not convinced that equality was necessary. So how do you deal with that? African Americans and Native Americans are demanding equality. Part of how white people dealt with that dilemma of sorts was to argue for colonization. Send African Americans to Africa or Haiti, remove Native Americans to the far west.
Mm-hmm.
Those are different plans, and they go different ways, but that's similar impulse.
But they're similar in a certain way, right? At least,
Yeah.
at least conceptually, they're similar.
Yeah, and that
Yeah.
the United States is a white republic.
Mm-hmm.
That is the dominant view in the 1830s in the North as well as the South.
And as the structures of slavery and as the structures of, let's say, dispossession that define American Indian communities, or erasure define American Indian communities, as those wither away, the stresses or the worries or the anxieties of the white classes become more acute, right? Because that's what we're arguing, right? That without those pieces that they themselves in many cases are argued against, when those structures are gone, then they're faced with a future that they hadn't bargained for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Segregation, just like after the Civil War,
Exactly.
segregation follows the end of slavery.
Exactly. And thinking as well of through the 20th century and the concept of separate but equal as sort of in some ways a 20th century framework, right? And that even though it is nonsense, but it is a salve in some ways, that it's equal, but just let's not have social interaction.
Yeah.
Right. Let's have separation. So it's a similar set of anxieties, and we could argue that these things are happening in our world today, right? As the structures are being disrupted in multiple ways. So I want to move. We got about 7 minutes to go, and I want to remind everybody that we have time to throw some questions in the chat for Dr. Richard Boles, why it matters. A different kind of question here, and this one struck me when I was reading the book, and it shows up, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it. So where are the Quakers in this? Right? Because the Quakers, are they the counterexample, and sort of how are they operating in this world, right? Because they're small in number, but larger in the kind of cultural imagination, maybe in some ways.
Yeah. Quakers are not a big part of this study. We know a lot more, I think, about Quakers, and we know that Quakers were the earliest white Christians to denounce slavery, especially in the North. And we know that the Quakers are instrumental to the ending of slavery in the North and to the abolitionist movement against slavery in the South. Perhaps ironically, Quakers were not as consistent about welcoming and incorporating African Americans into their meetings. So they're crucial advocates for African Americans, but they were less interracial in their own meetings in many places. But that history has been well covered by other people.
Yeah.
So I sort of decided to leave it aside. The other reason I left Quakers aside was that in the 18th century and 19th century, they didn't baptize anybody. So because I was relying so heavily upon baptismal records, this religious group didn't quite fit that sort of comparative analysis because they didn't do that. They didn't baptize.
They didn't. And there were other kinds of records they didn't keep either, right? In terms of death records and things like that, or at least parts of Quakerism, they didn't keep anything. It was, or at least not much.
Yeah.
Right. So, but talking about the Quakers and their reputation for being vocal opponents of slavery and other forms of injustice. Mm-hmm. In this last book, the last chapter focuses on other voices that really rise, and I find this is just a great way that this book ends, and it's really powerful in so many ways. And really, what you're focused on are some African American and indigenous radicalism, individuals who are speaking directly and forcefully against segregation, marginalization, abuse. So maybe you can tell us some of these are some well-known figures who at the end of your book, emerge and for me really take over the conversation. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the end of the book focuses a lot on the sermons and the writings of William Apis, Pequot from Connecticut, and David Walker, who was African American, born free in the South, but then moved to Boston. And they're both, William Apis is an ordained Methodist. David Walker goes to a Methodist church, Black Methodist church in Boston, an AME church. And so both of them are influenced by the Methodist tradition. But they are arguing and articulating a Christian radicalism that is different than the ways that Richard Allen and Samson Occom and Absalom Jones critiqued white hypocrisy of the earlier time period. Walker and Apis are not just critiquing white Christians for hypocrisy, they're going further, and that's why I sort of call it Christian radicalism. They're saying that white Christians, because of their actions, because of the way that they treat Native Americans, this is in the context again of Indian removals,
yes.
And the way that they continue to enslave and segregate African Americans. Apis and Walker say white Americans are not Christians. They call them pretend Christians. Frederick Douglass echoes the same idea a little bit later on in one of his autobiographies. And this is really a reversal of the imperialism, the Christian imperialism of earlier time periods. Some Europeans justified colonization of North America as bringing the gospel. When you think back to the company seal for the Massachusetts Bay Company, and you think of Christians who argued that the slave trade was justified or justifiable because it brought Christianity to Africa, to Africans. And so there's a sense of Europeans colonizing and enslaving to spread Christianity. Well, Walker and Apis are saying, no. Black and indigenous people are the real Christians. And we know we're the real Christians because we love each other and we love our enemies. And they have lots of examples, and they talk about it, and they talk about King Philip's Pumeticom as an example of Christian patience. He was not involved in any Christian church, but pointing to him as being more Christ-like than Puritans, more Christ-like than 19th century Christians. And so Walker and Apis say, the judgment of God is coming for the sin of slavery, for dispossession of Native Americans. God will judge for these things. And if white Americans want to avoid God's judgment, they need to convert to Christianity.
Indeed.
And I think it's a powerful
reversal.
Turning
it, and it's right. It's really a powerful reversal and forceful and moving. I want to end with one quick question about looking at this book from our moment in time. And when I read this, I was thinking about the recovery of this history that you offer, but also this deeper conversation, right, about identity and segregation and belonging, and how it is that we come to understand American history and the sort of the long trajectory of American history, right, and what it is that this book tells us about who we are, and I'm thinking particularly we're in the middle of some deep conversations about race. We're in the middle of conversations about belonging and how it is that we live with one another. So maybe you can just sort of stretch out for just a moment and say, how does this, studying this, how did this study cause you to think about what's around all of us?
Yeah, I'd maybe summarize this, what it means for the present, what it means for me, what it means for us, with two concepts, complicity and reconciliation. Maybe those are two sides of a coin. I think Northerners, New Yorkers, New Englanders need to understand slavery, and that the North had slavery, and that the North has a history of racism that it has to deal with. I think that American churches, Northern churches, need to understand the ways that they were complicit with slavery and other injustices. And so understanding that complicity means that race relations is not simply a Southern problem, right? Some people in the North don't, that's a problem over there or down there. It's really a national conversation that we need to have, all regions of the country. And the reconciliation piece, I think, goes along with that, right? Understanding the history, dealing with the history. I think churches need to, or churches might want to engage with questions of repentance or reparation in those Christian senses as ways of bringing about reconciliation. A lot of people care about reconciliation right now, and that's important. And I think this history, this deep history, the history of how American churches became so divided along racial lines has to be addressed as part of those broader conversations.
Brilliant. And I, when you use the word reparations, it's one that causes anxiety. And I'm reminded of the root is repair, right? Is repair. So with that, thank you so much. That was an absolutely wonderful conversation. And I want to thank everybody who's tuned in to these 5 talks and really participated in this journey over this past number of months with us. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've explored in detail a diverse set of topics, but I think all of them have been united in a larger kind of conversation about what it is that we learn from studying our past and how we apply it to our present. Studying the past isn't about, the old adage of, we need to learn the past in order that it doesn't repeat itself. The old saying, right, really needs a kind of a postscript, which is that history doesn't repeat, but historians do, right? So we repeat ourselves. The issue really is what we make of all of this, just as Dr. Boles was talking about reconciliation and complicity, and that these stories are really not so much about repeating as learning and thinking more deeply about who we are as a people and how it is that we are the journeys that we've taken collectively and separately help us and prepare us for a journey that we're moving forward, and one that's hopefully a bit more respectful of one another. So that's the point, right? That's why it matters, and that's why we're so happy to have had these 5 scholars join us and all of you. And like I said, thank you all. Thank you for joining us, and keep a lookout on social media as we begin to explore and think about what next season's set of episodes looks like. Again, thank you very much to our wonderful production team, OSU Libraries, the Foundation, College of Arts and Sciences, Sarah Griswold, Katana Davis, all of our great partners. And with that, good afternoon.